the shadowed bayous where whispers of the damned linger like Spanish moss. A slave rose to claim his master's throne through a trail of blood and forbidden vows. Down in the shadowed bayous of Iberville Parish, Louisiana, there lingers a parchment that has confounded scholars for more than a century. A land title logged in the fall of 1852 that details something that ought to have been unthinkable under every decree of the antebellum South. A soul named Absalom, born bound to servitude on Magnolia Shade Plantation, emerged as rightful holder of that very estate, scarce 8 months past his owner's passing. Yet the tale don't cease there. In a turn that mocked all customs of the era, Absalom wedded his late owner's widow, a fair lady from a venerable Creole lineage mere 40 days following the burial. The parish scribe who noted their union license scrawled in the edge, "Lord have mercy upon our souls." Inside that first year of Absalom's liberty, 6 folks who doubted his swift ascent to might perished in ways the lawman shunned to probe deeply. His old master, Roderick Beaumont, turned up lifeless with a fowling piece upon his knees. Still, notes in the locked coroner's ledger clashed with the formal ruling of self-murder. The pair of pale overseers who defied Absalom's sway both faded within moons of one another. A clergyman who sought to meddle Medeth in what powers deemed a mishap astride his mount. By 1853, Absalom Beaumont, the title he claimed after binding to the widow, commanded one of the richest holdings in Iberville Parish. The query that shadowed all who grasped the saga was plain yet dreadful. How many souls had fallen to forge this forbidden shift? Here we press on with the chronicle of Absalom and the crimson trail from slave cabins to manor lord. I yearn to hear your voice. Pledge to this channel if the gloomiest passages of American lore captivate you, and drop a word naming the state or town whence you heed. This is a legend long entombed by design for ages, and your fellowship aids in unveiling these forsaken verities. The happenings I aim to unfold for you have been woven from parish ledgers, intimate missives, ledger tomes, and accounts from a veiled inquest scarce known to have breathed. What befell at Magnolia Shade Plantation defies all we reckon of dominion, fealty, and endurance in the Old South. Magnolia Shade Plantation crouched on a curve of the bayou in Iberville Parish, Louisiana, where the earth lay dark and fertile enough to yield cane that drew fine coin in New Orleans. The domain stretched nigh 800 acres, its edges traced by hoary live oaks cloaked in Spanish moss that drank the thick Louisiana mist. The grand house climbed 3 levels high, crafted in French colonial grace with broad verandas encircling each tier, lofty panes that swung wide to snare the water's sigh, and pillars that braved tempests for 3 bloodlines. Roderick Beaumont had claimed Magnolia Shade from his sire in 1838. With 63 bound souls, a cane press that ground stalks from nearby spreads, and burdens that might crush a frailer spirit. But Roderick was no frail spirit. He was driven, shrewd, and blessed with a keen wit that spied fortune where others beheld but barriers. By 1850, he had swelled his chattel to 92 souls, cleared his sire's debts, and planted himself amid the parish's gentry. His triumph sprang partly from farming cunning. He ranked early in adopting steam-driven gears for his cane press, but more so from his bent to watch and glean from those he held. Absalom had been birthed on Magnolia Shade in 1822, offspring of a woman called Endurance who toiled in the grand house and a sire whose mark was never etched in the domain's tomes. From boyhood, Absalom showed traits that both enchanted and disquieted those near him. He grasped letters by spying Roderick's offspring with their tutor, etching teachings through the salon pane. He schooled himself in joinery by eyeing the estate's artisans, then outstripped their crafteray his 15th year. He knew soil turns, storm signs, and the tangled trade of cane yield finer than many taskmasters. Most wondrous, he held a gift to fathom folk, to grasp their dreads, yearnings, and frailties with a sureness that verged on unearthly. Roderick Beaumont discerned Absalom's sharpness soon, and chose a path most lords would deem perilous. He bestowed Absalom duty, first as foreman guiding field hands, then as press runner, and at last as his own aid in steering the domain's dealings. Roderick kept Absalom near, leaned on his discernment, entrusted him with secrets other bound souls ne'er touched. It was a pact that served both men. Roderick's gains swelled markedly under Absalom's deft stewardship, while Absalom reaped wisdom and sway beyond reach for one in his lot. But a shadow wove through their bond that strangers could not wholly see. Roderick's wife Seraphina had come to Magnolia Shade in 1845, the 19-year maid of a waning Creole kin in New Orleans. Her sire had heaped wagering debts that menaced the clan's honor, and wedding her to the affluent Roderick Beaumont, 15 years her elder, had been a cunning cure. Seraphina brought grace, polish, and ties to Magnolia Shade. She brought no warmth for her spouse. The estate's order in 1852, Louisiana, was sternly drawn by code and right. Yet in that stern frame dwelt endless faint barters of might. The pale taskmasters, men like Jedediah Hawthorne and his kin Ezekiel, held formal reign over all bound toilers. Boot in truth, Absalom bore more pull. He governed entry to Roderick, doled labor posts, and kept the ledgers that marked every thread of estate workings. The Hawthorne brethren chafed at this weave deeply, but Roderick spurned their grumbles with a cold sense that enraged them. Absalom earned him wealth, and wealth outweighed their bruised honor. The manor staff numbered 12 who served in the grand house, and they dwelt in a queer midway in the estate's ladder. Matilda, who had nursed Roderick as a babe and now ruled the household, drew regard from both pale and dark dwellers. Her offspring, Coraline, served as Seraphina's own attendant, and held a spot that lent her deep knowing of the lady's hidden days. The scullery fell under old Zebulon, a soul of untold seasons, who had fed 3 lines of Beaumont, and whom all eyed with wary awe. By the vernal tide of 1852, magnolia shade seemed to flourish. The prior reap had shown rare. Roderick had bartered sound packs with New Orleans brokers, and the domain's fame lured buyers keen to pay dear rates. The grand house sheltered suppers where parish gentry met to weigh governance, cotton fates, and the rising rifts twixt north and south. Roderick preached fervent on state's claims and the Southern creed, never owning the mockery that his deft pleas for that creed oft drew from views and gleams Absalom had passed him earlier that same dawn. But beneath this thriving veil, strains were mounting that would soon rend magnolia shade asunder. Absalom had passed 30 years watching, gleaning, and biding. He grasped the estate's rhythms deeper than Roderick himself. He knew which bordering lords teetered on ruin, which brokers in New Orleans might be swayed, which codes could be twisted, and which souls could be bent. He had been readying for a reckoning, though few guessed what or when it might dawn, what none wholly fathomed, what perchance even Absalom himself grasped not till too late. Washoe utterly the estate's fragile order would crumble once one vital thread was plucked. The whole frame of magnolia shade leaned on Roderick Beaumont's sway, and that sway leaned on naught more firm than custom, code, and the shared pact that it must be. Pluck that base and all raised and it must be rebargained. The summer of 1852 would bear just how brittle that base truly lay. The eve of June 17, 1852 dawned like endless others at Magnolia Shade. The day's swelter had been crushing even by Louisiana measure, urging all to hunt shade by mid-noon. Roderick had passed the hours pouring ledgers with Absalom, sifting tallies for the coming sowing time and sifting figures for the upcoming planting season, and discussing a potential land purchase from a neighboring planter whose son's gambling debts had grown unmanageable. They had worked in Roderick's study, a room in the second floor of the main house that overlooked the river, its windows open to catch whatever breeze might stir the thick air. Seraphina had complained of a headache and remained in her chambers for most of the day, attended only by Coraline. This was not unusual. Seraphina frequently retreated from the household, claiming various ailments that required privacy and rest. The household staff had learned not to disturb her during these episodes, though Matilda sometimes muttered that a woman who ate so little and slept so much was inviting illness rather than recovering from it. At 7, Roderick dismissed Absalom and called for his evening meal to be brought to his study. He had letters to write, he said, and preferred to work undisturbed. This too was not unusual. Roderick often conducted business correspondence in the evening, particularly during the planting and harvest seasons. Matilda supervised as Zebulon prepared a tray with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a bottle of Roderick's preferred claret. Coraline carried the tray upstairs, knocked on the study door, received Roderick's acknowledgement, and left it on the table just inside the entrance. What happened in the hours that followed has been reconstructed from testimony given during the inquiry, though significant gaps remain in the account. At approximately 9:30, Jedediah Hawthorne, making his evening rounds of the property, noticed that lamplight still burned in Roderick's study. This detail would later prove important, though at the time it seemed unremarkable. At some point between 9:30 and 11 cause, someone entered Roderick's study. The door had been locked from the inside, but whoever entered possessed either a key or the ability to persuade Roderick to unlock it. At 11:45, Matilda was awakened by a sound she described as something heavy falling. She rose, lit a candle, and made her way through the dark house toward Roderick's study. The door stood slightly ajar. She was certain it had been closed when she passed by earlier, and lamplight spilled into the hallway. She pushed the door open and saw Roderick Beaumont slumped in his desk chair, his head thrown back at an unnatural angle, his hunting rifle across his lap, and a significant amount of blood on the wall behind him. Matilda's scream brought the household running. Within minutes, Absalom, Seraphina, Coraline, the Hawthorne brothers, and several house servants had gathered in the study. The scene appeared straightforward. Roderick had shot himself with his own rifle, the barrel placed beneath his chin. The weapon was one he kept mounted above his desk, a Kentucky long rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. Powder burns marred his chin and throat, and the bullet had exited through the top of his skull, lodging in the ceiling beam above. Jedediah Hawthorne immediately assumed command of the situation, as was expected, given his position as senior overseer. He ordered everyone except Ezekiel out of the room, then dispatched a rider to fetch Dr. Silas Evergreen from his home 5 miles distant. He questioned Matilda about who had been in the house that evening, and who might have heard anything unusual. He examined the study for signs of disturbance and found none. No overturned furniture, no indication of struggle, no forced entry. Dr. Evergreen arrived shortly after 1 a.m. in the morning. He examined the body briefly, confirmed the obvious cause of death, and estimated that Roderick had been dead approximately 2 to 3 hours. He noted the powder burns, the trajectory of the bullet, and the position of the body. His initial conclusion recorded in his notes was suicide. However, he also observed several details that troubled him enough to include them in a separate, more detailed report he would later submit to the parish coroner. First, Roderick's hands showed no powder residue beyond what one would expect from recently handling the rifle. Second, the rifle had been found across Roderick's lap in a position that seemed awkward for someone who had just used it to shoot himself. Third, a bottle of claret on the desk was nearly empty, but Roderick was known as a moderate drinker who rarely consumed more than 2 glasses with dinner. Fourth, and most disturbing, Roderick's face bore an expression that Dr. Evergreen struggled to characterize. Not the blank emptiness of sudden death, but something that resembled profound surprise mixed with what the doctor could only describe as recognition, as if Roderick had understood something important in his final moment. The household spent the remainder of that night in a state of controlled chaos. Serafina, after viewing her husband's body, had become hysterical, screaming, tearing at her hair, and requiring restraint by both Matilda and Coraline before Dr. Evergreen could administer laudanum. The Hawthorne brothers posted themselves in the study as guards, though what they were guarding against was unclear. Absalom took charge of practical arrangements, sending riders to notify Roderick's brother in Baton Rouge and the parish priest, organizing the household staff to begin preparations for the funeral, and ensuring that nothing in the study was disturbed until proper authorities could investigate. It was Absalom's calm efficiency during this crisis that first raised suspicions in Jedediah Hawthorne's mind. A man's master had just died violently, yet Absalom showed no visible distress, no disruption to his usual methodical competence. He gave orders as if he had anticipated this moment, as if he had already thought through every necessary step. When Hawthorne mentioned this observation to his brother later that morning, Ezekiel responded with a question that would echo through subsequent events. "How long do you think Absalom has been waiting for this?" The official investigation began at dawn. Sheriff Lucian Bayard arrived from the parish seat accompanied by 2 deputies and a justice of the peace named Elias Voss. They examined the study, questioned the household, and reviewed Dr. Evergreen's preliminary findings. By noon, they had reached their conclusion. Roderick Beaumont had taken his own life while intoxicated and despondent over financial troubles. The verdict satisfied legal requirements and preserved the family's reputation. Suicide was scandal enough without adding suggestions of foul play or household conspiracy, but several people found the official verdict difficult to accept. Jedediah Hawthorne insisted that Roderick had shown no signs of despondency, and had in fact been enthusiastic about upcoming business ventures. Roderick's brother Thibault, who arrived late on the 18th, pointed out that the family's finances were actually quite healthy, something he verified by reviewing the estate's account books with Absalom. Dr. Evergreen privately maintained his reservations about certain physical evidence, and Matilda, who had served the Beaumont family for 45 years, told Agnon, who would listen, that Roderick was not the type of man who would abandon his responsibilities through suicide, no matter what troubles he faced. Yet the inquiry was closed, the death certificate was signed, and preparations for Roderick's burial proceeded. According to Louisiana law and Catholic custom, he should have been interred quickly, but the heat was intense, and Thibault insisted on delaying the funeral until more family members could travel from New Orleans. Roderick's body was placed in a sealed coffin in the plantation's ice house, and the funeral was scheduled for June 22nd. During those 5 days between death and burial, Magnolia Shade Plantation existed in a strange state of suspension. All normal work continued. The field still required tending. The mill still operated. The household still functioned. But everyone understood that fundamental change was coming. The question was what form that change would take. Thibault had legal authority as Roderick's closest male relative, but he lived in Baton Rouge and had his own affairs to manage. Serafina was Roderick's widow and would inherit significant assets. But Louisiana law restricted women's control over property, and she showed no capacity or desire to manage a plantation. The Hawthorne brothers assumed they would step into positions of greater authority, but they needed someone to sign their orders, someone with legal standing. Absalom continued managing daily operations as he had under Roderick, and everyone accepted this arrangement because the alternative was chaos. He met with Thibault to review accounts, corresponded with Roderick's factor in New Orleans about existing contracts, and made decisions about planting schedules that could not wait for a solution of the estate. He did all of this with the same calm competence he had always shown, and people began to forget, or perhaps they never truly believed, that his legal status had not changed. He was still enslaved. Every decision he made, every order he gave, every signature he placed on documents had no legal authority whatsoever. On June 21st, the evening before Roderick's funeral, Absalom requested a private meeting with Seraphina. They met in Thesmall Parlor off the main hall, the same room where Roderick had once conducted business with visiting planters. Coraline stood outside the closed door. Propriety required a witness to any meeting between a white woman and an enslaved man, but she later testified that she could not hear what was discussed. The meeting lasted approximately 45 minutes. When Absalom emerged, his expression revealed nothing. When Seraphina emerged 10 minutes later, she looked as if she had made a decision that both terrified and relieved her. The funeral took place on a Wednesday afternoon with heat so oppressive that several attendees fainted during the graveside service. Father Ignatius Crowe conducted the ceremony, speaking of Roderick's contributions to the parish, his business acumen, and his devotion to the Southern cause. He did not mention suicide. Such things were not discussed openly, but everyone present understood the implications of the carefully chosen words about God's mercy and the mysterious trials that test even the strongest souls. Thibault Beaumont departed immediately after the funeral, explaining that urgent business required his return to Baton Rouge. Before leaving, he had a brief conversation with Jedediah Hawthorne, in which he stated that the plantation's management would remain under current arrangements until the estate was properly settled. What those current arrangements were exactly, he did not specify. Hawthorne understood that he was being told to accept Absalom's continued authority, at least temporarily, and this understanding did nothing to diminish his growing resentment. That evening, as the household was settling after the exhausting day, Matilda was cleaning Roderick's study, a task she had delayed as long as possible, when she noticed something that stopped her cold. The hunting rifle that had killed Roderick was back in its usual place above the desk. She was certain it had been taken as evidence by Sheriff Bayard. She was even more certain that she had not seen anyone return it. She mentioned this to Absalom, who told her that Thibault had arranged for its return before departing. This explanation was reasonable. Yet something about the way Absalom delivered it, or perhaps something about the way the rifle, now hung, cleaned, and oiled, as if waiting to be used again, left Matilda profoundly uneasy. One other detail from that day deserves mention. Late in the evening, after most of the household had retired, Coraline was helping Seraphina prepare for bed, when she noticed that her mistress was wearing a necklace Coraline had never seen before. It was a simple piece, a gold chain with a small locket, old-fashioned in style but well-crafted. When Coraline asked about it, Seraphina touched it absently and said it had belonged to her grandmother. Coraline did not press the question, though she thought it odd that Seraphina would choose to wear a new piece of jewelry on the day of her husband's funeral. She did not know, could not have known, that inside the locket was a small curl of dark hair and a folded paper containing 7 words written in Absalom's distinctive hand. What we have begun cannot be undone. The weeks following Roderick's death revealed fractures in Magnolia Shade's social structure that had always existed beneath the surface, but had been held in check by the weight of established authority. With that authority removed, every relationship, every assumption, every unspoken arrangement came into question. The plantation did not collapse immediately. That would come later, but it began a slow transformation that alarmed everyone who understood what they were witnessing. Absalom continued to run Magnolia Shade's operations with an efficiency that even the Hawthorne brothers could not fault. The crops were tended, the mill operated profitably. Contracts with New Orleans factors were maintained, and the estate's accounts showed continued income. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, everything had changed. Absalom no longer sought approval for his decisions, no longer presented plans for someone else to authorize. He simply acted, and the momentum of habit and the absence of clear alternative authority meant that people accepted his actions as legitimate. Seraphina remained secluded in the main house, appearing only for meals and necessary social obligations. She met weekly with Father Crowe, who visited to provide spiritual comfort during her mourning period. She received condolence calls from neighboring plantation wives, though these visits became less frequent as rumors began to circulate about her relationship with Absalom. She wore black, observed the proper forms of widowhood, and gave no outward indication that she was anything other than a grieving wife awaiting settlement of her husband's estate. But those who worked in the main house knew better. Coraline, whose position as Seraphina's personal maid gave her intimate access to her mistress's private life, observed meetings between Seraphina and Absalom that occurred with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense of propriety. They met in the parlor in Roderick's former study on the gallery in the evening. They spoke in low voices, sometimes in French, which Absalom had somehow learned despite having no formal education. They reviewed documents together, documents that Coraline glimpsed but could not read, papers covered with legal language and official seals. Matilda noticed changes in the household's operation that suggested a shift in authority. Seraphina began making decisions about provisions, about which servants should be assigned to which tasks, about matters that widows typically left to male relatives or overseers. But her decisions were never announced directly. They came through Absalom, delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence that people complied before questioning whether Seraphina actually had the authority to make such determinations. The Hawthorne brothers recognized that their position was being undermined, but they struggled to articulate exactly how or to identify a specific violation they could challenge. Absalom gave them no direct orders that would have been an inexcusable breach of racial hierarchy. Instead, he simply informed them of decisions that had been made, changes that would be implemented, arrangements that were now in place. When they protested, he referred them to Seraphina, who confirmed that yes, these change had her approval as mistress of the estate. When they questioned whether Seraphina had the legal authority to approve such changes, Absalom pointed out that the estate was still in probate and that Thibault Beaumont had explicitly stated that current arrangement should continue. By late July, Jedediah Hawthorne had become convinced that Absalom was manipulating Seraphina, possibly through threats, possibly through some other form of coercion he could not quite define. He shared these suspicions with his brother, with several neighboring overseers, and eventually with Sheriff Bayard during a chance meeting in the parish seat. The sheriff listened politely but pointed out that suspicion was not evidence, and unless Hawthorne could demonstrate actual wrongdoing, actual crime, there was nothing the law could do. The sheriff also reminded him with careful emphasis that making unfounded accusations about a white woman's honor could have severe legal consequences for the accuser. On August 3rd, something occurred that brought these simmering tensions to a brief explosive confrontation. Absalom had arranged the sale of 60 hogsheads of sugar to a New Orleans factor, at a price significantly higher than Roderick had negotiated for the previous year's crop. This was objectively good business, but Jedediah Hawthorne chose to challenge the transaction, arguing that Absalom had no authority to negotiate contracts and that the sale should be voided. Absalom calmly explained that he had negotiated the deal on Seraphina's behalf with her full knowledge and approval, and that the contract had already been signed and the first payment received. Hawthorne, his frustration finally boiling over, made the mistake of explicitly stating what many had been thinking. "You forget your place, Absalom. You forget what you are." The confrontation took place in the mill office with half a dozen witnesses present. Absalom's response was quiet, measured, and absolutely devastating in its precision. "My place is wherever Madame Beaumont determines it to be. If you question my authority, you question hers. If you question hers, you question the arrangements made by Monsieur Thibault before his departure. If you wish to challenge those arrangements, I suggest you travel to Baton Rouge and discuss the matter with him directly. Until you do so, I will continue to perform the duties assigned to me by the mistress of this estate." It was a masterful piece of verbal maneuvering, simultaneously invoking multiple sources of authority while offering no direct challenge to the racial hierarchy that everyone understood governed their world. Hawthorne was trapped. He could not challenge Absalom without appearing to challenge Seraphina, could not challenge Seraphina without appearing to exceed his own authority, could not appeal to Thibault without admitting that he had lost control of the plantation he was supposed to be supervising. That same evening, Jedediah Hawthorne began drafting a letter to Thibault Beaumont, detailing his concerns about Absalom's growing influence and requesting clarification about the estate's management structure. He was still working on this letter when 2 days later he fell ill with symptoms that Dr. Evergreen initially diagnosed as cholera, severe intestinal distress accompanied by vomiting, fever, and delirium. The illness came on suddenly, progressed rapidly, and proved fatal within 48 hours. Jedediah Hawthorne died on August 7, 1852, 3 days after his confrontation with Absalom. Cholera was not uncommon in Louisiana during summer months, particularly near the river. The same week Hawthorne died. 2 slaves from a neighboring plantation and a merchant in the parish seat also succumbed to similar symptoms. Dr. Evergreen saw no reason to suspect foul play, though he noted in his records that the speed and severity of Hawthorne's decline was unusual, even for cholera. The body was buried quickly. The heat and the nature of the illness made this necessary, and Ezekiel Hawthorne found himself suddenly elevated to the position of sole overseer. Ezekiel lacked his brother's forceful personality and his certainty about how things should be. He had relied on Jedediah to make difficult decisions, to confront problems directly, to maintain the firm hand that everyone agreed was necessary in managing a large plantation. Without his brother, Ezekiel felt adrift. When Absalom approached him 3 days after the funeral with a proposal to restructure the overseer's responsibilities, ostensibly to reduce Ezekiel's workload during this difficult period, Ezekiel agreed without fully considering the implications. The new arrangement gave Ezekiel authority over field operations while Absalom retained control of business affairs, contracts, and financial management. It was, Absalom explained, simply a formal recognition of how things had been operating. Anyway, what Ezekiel did not realize until too late was that he had just accepted a subordinate position. The person who controls money and contracts controls everything else. Absalom now had official, or at least officially recognized, authority over the plantation's most important operations, while Ezekiel was relegated to supervising manual labor. It was a complete inversion of the normal hierarchy, accomplished so smoothly that Ezekiel only understood what had happened after the arrangement was already in place and functioning. Throughout these developments, one person watched with increasingly sharp attention and growing alarm. Old Zebulon, who had cooked for the Beaumont family for longer than most people on the plantation had been alive, had seen changes of power before. He had watched Roderick's father die and Roderick assume control. He had observed hirings and firings, marriages and deaths, the constant small negotiations of authority that occurred in any large household. But what he was witnessing now was different. This was not evolution. This was revolution conducted so gradually that most people did not recognize it as such. Zebulon began paying attention to things that others overlooked. He noticed that Seraphina no longer took her meals in the formal dining room, but instead ate in her private chambers, with Coraline bringing trays that Absalom had personally selected from Zebulon's kitchen. He observed that Coraline carried notes between Absalom and Seraphina several times each day, more communication than would seem necessary for simple household management. He saw that Matilda, who had once held undisputed authority over the household staff, now consulted with Absalom before making decisions about staffing or supplies. Most troubling of all, Zebulon noticed that people were disappearing. Not literally disappearing, nothing so dramatic, but gradually being removed from positions where they might observe or interfere with whatever was unfolding. 3 house servants had been reassigned to field work, a change that Absalom explained as necessary due to reduced household needs during mourning. 2 field workers known for their loyalty to the Hawthorne brothers had been sold to a neighboring plantation, a transaction Absalom described as financially advantageous. The butler, who had served Roderick for 15 years, had been dismissed for drunkenness, a charge that Matilda privately disputed, but could not disprove. When Zebulon mentioned these observations to Matilda, she responded with something that surprised him. Fear, not anger, not indignation, but genuine fear. "Do not speak of these things," she told him. "Do not even think them too loudly. There are changes coming that we cannot prevent, and the only safety is in not noticing them." On September 12, 1852, exactly 12 weeks after Roderick Beaumont's death, Absalom appeared before Justice Voss in the parish seat, accompanied by Seraphina and a lawyer from New Orleans named Edmond Lafitte. The purpose of their visit was to present documents related to Roderick's estate and to request the court's approval of certain arrangements. The documents included Roderick's will, which had apparently been revised just 2 months before his death, a power of attorney granting Seraphina authority to manage the estate during probate, and a manumission paper for Absalom signed by Roderick and dated April 15, 1852. The will was straightforward enough. It left the bulk of Roderick's estate to Seraphina with provisions for his brother Thibaut, and small bequests to several friends and distant relatives. Nothing in the will was unusual for a man without children. The power of attorney was also unremarkable, giving Seraphina broad authority to conduct business on the estate's behalf during the probate period. The manumission paper was more problematic. It stated that Roderick Beaumont, in recognition of Absalom's faithful service, exceptional intelligence, and invaluable contributions to the prosperity of Magnolia Shade Plantation, hereby granted him freedom to take effect immediately. It was properly executed with Roderick's signature and the required witness signatures, but it had never been filed with the parish clerk. As Louisiana law required for manumissions to be legally valid, Absalom's lawyer argued that this was a mere technicality, that Roderick had clearly intended to grant freedom and had executed the proper document, and the failure to file was an administrative oversight that should not invalidate Roderick's explicit wishes. Justice Voss was not a naive man, understood that he was looking at a situation that violated every norm of Louisiana society, that challenged assumptions about race and power that formed the foundation of the entire system. He also understood that he was being presented with technically legal documents properly executed and notarized. He could reject them. He had the authority to do so. But on what grounds? Because the situation made him uncomfortable? Because it seemed suspicious? Because it violated unwritten rules about how things should be? After considerable deliberation, Justice Voss accepted the documents for filing. He approved the manumission, granted Serafina the requested authority, and entered the will into probate. In his private journal that evening he wrote, "I have today performed an act that may haunt me for the rest of my life. I have set in motion events that I suspect will not end well. But I have been presented with legal documents that meet all requirements of law, and I have no basis on which to reject them. May God forgive me if I have been deceived, and may He protect those who may suffer from my decision." The news of Absalom's manumission spread through the parish with remarkable speed. Reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage to a kind of fascinated horror. Neighboring planters began avoiding contact with magnolia shade, treating it as if it were contaminated. The parish elite, who had once attended Roderick's dinner parties, now refused invitations to visit. Father Crow continued his pastoral visits to Serafina, but he made clear his deep reservations about the situation and urged her repeatedly to consider the consequences of her choices. Ezekiel Hawthorne, upon hearing that Absalom was now legally free, submitted his resignation effective immediately. He could not, he said, continue working under such circumstances. Absalom accepted his resignation with perfect politeness and hired a new overseer within a week, a man named Amos Pritchard, who had worked on plantations in Mississippi and who seemed either ignorant of or indifferent to the unconventional arrangement at Magnolia Shade. Throughout all of these developments, Absalom maintained the same calm demeanor he had always shown. He conducted business, managed operations, and spoke with unfailing courtesy to everyone. He made no dramatic gestures, issued no proclamations, engaged in no behavior that could be characterized as insolent or presumptuous. He simply continued doing what he had been doing with the single but monumental difference that he now did it as a free man. The question that everyone asked, that some asked openly and others only in whispers, was how this had happened. How had Absalom convinced Roderick to sign a manumission paper? How had he obtained Roderick's revised will? How had he persuaded Serafina to support his freedom and to work with him in managing the estate? The obvious answer, the answer most people assumed, was that Absalom had somehow manipulated or coerced these things through threats, blackmail, or exploitation of Serafina's grief and vulnerability. But a few people, those who had observed most closely, suspected something more complex and more disturbing. They suspected that Absalom had spent years, perhaps his entire life, preparing for this moment, that he'd studied Roderick so thoroughly that he understood exactly how to present himself as indispensable, that he had cultivated Serafina's trust and possibly her affection through calculated attention over months or years, that he'd positioned himself so strategically that when Roderick died, he was the only person who could hold the estate together, making his freedom and authority necessary rather than simply desired. And beneath these suspicions lay an even more troubling question that few people dared to voice. Had Roderick Beaumontrioli taken his own life? Or had Absalom engineered his death so skillfully that it appeared to be suicide? The official investigation had been cursory, the evidence circumstantial, the conclusion convenient. Dr. Evergreen's reservations had been noted, but never seriously pursued. The hunting rifle had been returned to its place above the desk with suspicious speed, and the one person who had directly challenged Absalom's authority, Jedediah Hawthorne, had died suddenly just days after that challenge. These questions had no answers, only implications, and the implications were terrifying enough that most people preferred not to think about them too carefully. It was easier to accept the official explanations, to believe that Roderick had succumbed to despair, that Absalom had simply been fortunate, that Serafina was a confused widow making poor decisions under the influence of grief. But late at night, when people were alone with their thoughts, many of them wondered if Absalom could transform himself from slave to free man, from property to property owner in the space of 3 months. What else might he be capable of? And if he had been willing to do whatever it took to achieve this transformation, anything at all, how many people had already paid the price for his ambition, and how many more would pay before the story reached its end? The autumn of 1852 brought cooler weather, but no reduction in the tension surrounding Magnolia Shade. The plantation continued to operate profitably. The crops were harvested successfully, and Absalom's management proved as competent as it had been under Roderick's ownership. But the social isolation of the estate deepened. Neighboring planters refused to conduct business with Magnolia Shade. Merchants in the parish seat provided necessary supplies, but did so with cold formality. The few visitors who came were strangers, factors from New Orleans, lawyers, businessmen who cared more about profit than propriety. What do you think is unfolding at Magnolia Shade? The evidence suggests something darker than anyone dared speak aloud. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the most disturbing revelations are still to come. The true nature of what was occurring at Magnolia Shade became impossible to ignore on November 28, 1852, when Serafina Beaumont and Absalom appeared together at the parish clerk's office to file an application for a marriage license. The clerk, a man named Prosper Gautier, who had held his position for 23 years, initially assumed he had misunderstood their request. When Absalom calmly repeated it, Gautier's hands began to shake. Absalom pointed out with careful precision that Louisiana law prohibited such marriages for enslaved persons or recently freed people of color. He was neither. His manumission had been filed in September. He had consulted with lawyers in New Orleans and knew exactly which laws applied. After 3 hours of discussion, Gautier found himself unable to identify a specific legal basis to deny the application. The arrangements involved a defrocked Catholic priest named Father Malachi Grimm, expelled from the diocese 5 years earlier for alcoholism. Grimm agreed to conduct the wedding for a substantial fee. The ceremony took place on December 19, 1852, in Magnolia Shade's parlor. The only witnesses were Matilda, Coraline, old Zebulon, and the estate's lawyer. Father Grimm stumbled through the liturgy with breath that smelled of whiskey. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Serafina's hand trembled as Absalom placed a gold ring on her finger. By marrying Serafina, Absalom gained legal control of her inheritance from Roderick, which meant he now effectively owned Magnolia Shade Plantation. The reaction from the parish elite was immediate and furious. A group of planters met to discuss action. Some argued for violence, others for legal intervention. They settled on complete social and economic isolation. No one would do business with Magnolia Shade, but Absalom had anticipated this response. His factor in New Orleans was Joachim Tessier, an ambitious trader who cared more about profit than propriety. Tessier had connections to northern buyers, happy to purchase Louisiana sugar without concerning themselves with local scandals. The winter of 1852-1853 saw Magnolia Shade operating in complete isolation from its neighbors, but in growing connection to commercial networks beyond the parish. Serafina remained largely secluded in the main house, appearing in public only when necessary. Those who saw her described her as pale, thin, and emotionally withdrawn. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was flat and effectless. Coraline, who continued serving as her personal maid, observed that Serafina seemed relieved by her new situation. Absalom made all decisions, bore all responsibility, faced all conflict. Serafina simply existed in a state of passive acceptance. During the first months of 1853, several incidents suggested Absalom was consolidating control by removing potential threats. In February, a field worker named Jonah claimed to have information about what really happened to Master Roderick. Before he could share it, he disappeared. Absalom reported him as a runaway. In March, old Zebulon became ill with symptoms similar to those that had killed Jedediah Hawthorne. Severe intestinal distress, rapid decline, death within days. Ezekiel Hawthorne, now working in the parish seat, began collecting testimony from people who had lived at Magnolia Shade. He was convinced Absalom had murdered Roderick and possibly others. He interviewed former servants and examined parish records. On April 12, 1853, Ezekiel was found dead in his rented room. The official cause was apoplexy, sudden heart failure. He was 38 years old with no history of health problems. All of his notes and documents relating to Magnolia Shade had vanished. Dr. Evergreen noted in his private records that this was the fourth sudden death connected to Magnolia Shade in less than a year. The pattern troubled him deeply, but he had no medical evidence of foul play. In any case, he scheduled a meeting with Sheriff Bayard to discuss his concerns. Before that meeting could occur, Absalom visited him. They spoke for approximately 2 hours about medical matters. Then Absalom made a statement the doctor would never forget. You understand that the world operates according to natural laws. Sometimes people die for reasons that are perfectly natural but appear suspicious to those who don't understand the complexity of human mortality. It would be unfortunate if such misunderstandings led a respected physician to make accusations he could not substantiate. It was not explicitly a threat, but the implication was clear. Dr. Evergreen canceled his meeting with the sheriff. He never spoke publicly about his suspicions. In his private journal, he wrote, "I have today chosen cowardice over courage. I suspect I have allowed evil to continue unchecked because I lack the strength to confront it." By summer 1853, Absalom had achieved something impossible. He had gone from enslaved property to free man to legal owner of one of the most valuable plantations in the parish, all in 13 months. The cost measured in human lives remained unknown but was suspected to be substantial. What do you think is unfolding at Magnolia Shade? The evidence suggests something darker than anyone dared speak aloud. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the most disturbing revelations are still to come. The winter of 1853-1854 brought growing pressure from multiple directions. In January, planters sent a petition to the state legislature requesting tighter restrictions on manumission. The petition didn't mention Absalom by name, but everyone understood its target. The legislature debated, but ultimately took no action. The first serious threat came in March 1854, when a New Orleans lawyer named Philippe Dufresne appeared claiming to represent Roderick's distant relatives in France. They were challenging the validity of Roderick's will, arguing he had been mentally incompetent or under duress when he revised it. The lawsuit aimed to overturn Absalom's control by attacking Seraphina's inheritance. Absalom hired Charlner, a prominent New Orleans lawyer. The legal battle proceeded through spring 1854. In April, a barn at Magnolia Shade caught fire in the middle of the night, destroying equipment and nearly spreading to the sugar mill. The fire had started in 3 separate locations simultaneously, suggesting arson. In May, someone shot at Absalom as he rode along the plantation road. The shot missed and the shooter escaped. The most significant development involved Coraline. Her position gave her intimate knowledge of everything occurring in the main house. In June 1854, she approached Father Crow during a pastoral visit. She told him she believed Absalom had murdered Roderick and that she had evidence. Letters between Seraphina and Absalom that predated Roderick's death by several months. The letters demonstrated a relationship that was intimate and conspiratorial, focused on shared plans for the future. Coraline had hidden these letters, intending to present them to authorities. Father Crow was deeply disturbed. He wrote a letter to the bishop in New Orleans describing the situation and requesting advice. That letter was intercepted before it reached the bishop. On the night of June 23rd, Father Crow was found unconscious on the road between Magnolia Shade and his church. His horse was nearby, apparently having thrown its rider. The priest died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The official explanation was a tragic accident. Coraline understood immediately what had happened. She took the letters and documents she had hidden and fled Magnolia Shade in the middle of the night, heading toward New Orleans. She made it approximately 15 miles before she was found. The official account stated she'd been detained by a patrol watching for runaways. During detention, she became agitated and violent, suffering fatal injuries in the struggle. The documents she had been carrying were lost. No investigation was conducted. Seraphina did not attend her burial. Absalom sent a wreath. In August, the lawsuit reached a critical phase. Depositions would take place in September, representing a significant threat to Absalom's position. The night before they were scheduled to begin, Philippe Dufresne was attacked in his hotel room. 2 men beat him severely and stole all his legal papers. Dufresne survived but was left with permanent injuries that ended his career. The attackers were never identified. With Dufresne incapacitated and his documentation destroyed, the lawsuit collapsed. In October 1854, the court dismissed the challenge. Absalom had won again. But the attack on Dufresne marked a turning point. Everyone now understood that Absalom was not simply fortunate. He was willing to kill anyone who threatened his position. In November, Colonel Augustus Shaw organized a meeting of planters to discuss the Magnolia Shade situation. 23 men attended. They discussed options ranging from legal challenges to extra-legal violence. A committee was formed, 3 men who would plan to eliminate Absalom in a way that could be attributed to accident. Absalom learned about the meeting within 48 hours. He hired guards from New Orleans and transformed Magnolia Shade into a fortress. He varied his routines, never traveled alone, never followed predictable patterns. In December 1854, Lucien Broussard, one of the 3 men on the assassination committee, was found dead in his home, killed by a shotgun blast through a window. The investigation concluded it was a hunting accident, but the message was clear. Absalom knew who was planning to kill him. On Christmas Eve, someone fired 6 shots at Absalom as he returned to Magnolia Shade. His guards returned fire. 2 people were killed. One of Absalom's guards and one attacker identified as a man employed by Etienne Marceau. Marceau fled the parish that night and was never seen in Louisiana again. Colonel Shaw survived 3 more weeks before dying in January 1855, officially from pneumonia, though his symptoms resembled the intestinal illness that had killed others who opposed Absalom. By early 1855, Absalom had eliminated or driven away everyone who had actively threatened him. He had proven he could not be dislodged, could not be killed, could not be defeated. But this victory came at a cost. Magnolia Shade existed in complete social isolation. Absalom had what he wanted, freedom, property, power. But he had it in a prison of his own making, surrounded by guards, living with a wife who barely spoke. By spring 1859, Absalom had been effective master of Magnolia Shade for nearly 7 years. The estate continued generating profits, though isolation had taken its toll. Serafina's mental state had deteriorated dramatically. She rarely left her chambers, spoke to people who weren't present, moved through the house like a ghost. Dr. Evergreen could offer no diagnosis beyond melancholia. In May 1859, Matilda died peacefully at age 72. She left behind a sealed letter addressed to Dr. Evergreen. It contained her account of everything she had witnessed: the mysterious meetings, the suspicious deaths, the systematic elimination of anyone who might challenge Absalom. It was not legal evidence, but it provided a comprehensive narrative of Absalom's transformation through calculated murder. Dr. Evergreen read the letter and faced the decision that had haunted him for years. He chose to make a copy, seal the original with instructions to open it after his death, and deposit it with his lawyer in New Orleans. If Absalom killed him, at least the truth would eventually emerge. But Absalom did not kill him. By summer 1859, Absalom seemed to have lost interest in eliminating threats. In August 1859, Absalom announced he would free all enslaved people remaining on the plantation, immediate and complete freedom for 73 people. The economic implications were staggering. Magnolia Shade's entire labor force would disappear, making continued operation impossible. But Absalom proceeded anyway, filing manumission papers and making arrangements for those who wanted to leave. The decision mystified observers. Absalom had realized that continuing to operate Magnolia Shade as a slave plantation made him complicit in the same system that had enslaved him. Freeing the people he owned was an attempt to break that cycle. To prove his transformation meant something beyond mere role reversal. Without enslaved labor, the fields could not be worked. The mill could not be operated. By October 1859, Absalom had essentially dismantled the economic engine that had made Magnolia Shade valuable. Serafina's condition reached crisis. In September, she stopped eating entirely. Dr. Evergreen found her in profound physical and mental collapse, conscious but unresponsive, existing in a state between life and death. Serafina died on October 17, 1859, 7 years and 4 months after Roderick's death. The official cause was wasting disease and melancholia. Absalom did not attend the funeral, sending only a wreath and a note. May she find the peace that eluded her in life. After Serafina's death, Absalom was sole owner of Magnolia Shade. He had finally achieved absolute control, and he discovered it meant nothing to him. In November, he began selling off parts of Magnolia Shade, the mill, sections of land, equipment, livestock, furniture. By December, only the main house and a few surrounding acres remained. On December 28, 1859, Absalom summoned Dr. Evergreen. The doctor found him in Roderick's study, surrounded by documents, looking physically healthy, but emotionally exhausted. Absalom poured brandy and began to speak. What he said, Dr. Evergreen would later record in his journal. Absalom did not confess to murder, but he spoke about the nature of power, about what it cost to obtain and maintain. He spoke about slavery and freedom, about how both involved forms of control. He spoke about Serafina, about how their relationship had begun years before Roderick's death, about how they had planned together to create circumstances allowing them both to escape. He did not say explicitly they had killed Roderick, but the implication was clear. He did not detail the other deaths, but he acknowledged that many obstacles were removed and necessary actions were taken. Most disturbing, he spoke about regret. Not moral regret for people killed, but practical regret that his methods had isolated him so completely that victory became indistinguishable from defeat. He had achieved impossible transformation, but created a life that satisfied him less than the one he had escaped. At the end, Absalom asked, "If you could know with absolute certainty that a terrible injustice would be corrected through terrible methods, would you accept that bargain? Would you sacrifice others, many others, to achieve something that should never have been denied to you?" Dr. Evergreen replied that he did not know. Absalom smiled. That is the correct answer. Anyone who answers confidently does not understand the question. That was the last time Dr. Evergreen saw Absalom Beaumont. On January 12, 1860, Absalom disappeared from Magnolia Shade. He took with him whatever wealth he had accumulated from selling assets. He left no indication of where he was going. The house stood empty for weeks before neighbors noticed it had been abandoned. The remaining property eventually reverted to the state. No one ever saw Absalom Beaumont again. There were rumors, sightings in New Orleans, reports of a wealthy man of color in Mexico, but nothing confirmed. He disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. The story of Absalom Beaumont became a dark legend in Iberville Parish. People told different versions, emphasizing different elements. Some portrayed Absalom as a brilliant tactician who beat an oppressive system. Others described him as a monster who murdered his way to power. The truth preserved in documents discovered decades later was more disturbing than any legend. Dr. Evergreen's journal found after his death in 1871 provided a comprehensive account, based on direct observations. Matilda's sealed letter offered corroborating details. Together, they suggested Absalom had been responsible for numerous deaths and that Seraphina had aided him. But these documents also revealed something more complex. They showed Absalom had been shaped by a system that treated human beings as property, that denied people agency based solely on race, that created conditions where the only path to freedom was through violence. The system had created Absalom Beaumont by denying him every legitimate avenue to the life he wanted. The legal questions surrounding Magnolia Shade were never fully resolved. The deaths between 1852 and 1859 remained officially unsolved. No one faced legal consequences except Philippe Dufresne, who survived his attack but never practiced law again. In 1868, a northern journalist named Theodore Wexler investigated the Magnolia Shade story, but found most people refused to discuss it. He uncovered one intriguing detail. In 1867, a man matching Absalom's description had been seen in Veracruz, Mexico, operating a successful merchant business. The man called himself Maurice Beaumont and was accepted as white. Wexler traveled to Veracruz, but found no trace of him. The final piece emerged in 1903 when letters were donated to the Louisiana Historical Society. Among lawyer Lafitte's papers was correspondence with a client who signed only as A.B. The letters dated between 1860 and 1897 discussed financial and legal matters. In one letter from 1889, A.B. wrote, "I have lived for many years now under a different name, free of the burden of who I was and what I did. I've been successful, respected, and I have harmed no one since leaving Louisiana. Yet I remain haunted by whether my transformation was worth the price others paid. I traded their lives for my freedom, and I cannot determine whether this was justice or crime, revolution or murder." The letter continued, "I know history will judge me harshly if my story is ever fully told. I accept this judgment even as I maintain I had no other path available. The system that enslaved me created the monster who destroyed that system from within. If I am guilty, then slavery itself stands guilty of creating me. Whether these letters were actually written by Absalom cannot be proven, but they suggested he survived for at least 37 years after disappearing from Magnolia Shade, that he established a new life successfully, and that he spent those years grappling with the moral implications of his transformation. The story became a cautionary tale told differently depending on who was telling it. Some emphasized the danger of upsetting social order. Others pointed to it as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence. Still others dismissed it as exaggerated legend. The main house was demolished in 1887. The land was subdivided and sold. By 1900, nothing remained to mark where Magnolia Shade had stood. The cemetery where Roderick and Seraphina were buried was neglected for years before being restored in 1956. On Roderick's gravestone, Roderick Beaumont, 1807. 1852, beloved husband and master of Magnolia Shade. On Seraphina's, Seraphina Beaumont, 1826. 1859, may she rest in peace. No stone marked Absalom's grave because no one knew where or when he died. Perhaps he lived many more years under a different name. Perhaps he died shortly after leaving Louisiana. Perhaps he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder waiting for someone to recognize him. The story leaves us with uncomfortable questions. Was Absalom Beaumont a hero or Avalon? Was his transformation liberation or crime? Were his methods justified by the impossibility of achieving freedom through legitimate means, or do they damn him regardless? Did he prove individuals can overcome oppressive systems, or did he simply demonstrate that oppression creates monsters? These questions remain relevant because the conditions that created Absalom Beaumont, systems that deny people agency, that distribute power arbitrarily, that force individuals to choose between submission and violence, have never fully disappeared. And wherever those dynamics exist, there will be individuals like Absalom, brilliant and ruthless, who refuse to accept their assigned position, and who are willing to pay any price, anyone's price, to transform themselves. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Absalom Beaumont was justified in his actions? Or do his methods make him irredeemable? Could he have achieved freedom through other means? Or did the system leave him no choice but violence? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts on this dark chapter of Louisiana history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories exploring the shadows of America's past, subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates history's uncomfortable truths. Remember, the past is never as simple as we want it to be, and understanding its complexity is the only way to avoid repeating its worst mistakes.